Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Education Unlocked. I'm so excited to welcome today's guest, Chad Freeman, who's the Assistant Director of Student Services at Alvord Unified School District. Chad, it's so amazing to have you on the podcast. I'm so excited. And I'd love to have you start off with an introduction and then we can begin right in.
Sure. So again, thanks so much for having me on the podcast. Again, my name is Chad Freeman. I am actually started my educational journey way back. Actually, first started teaching in Maryland, in Montgomery County, Maryland. And I come from a family of educators. My grandmother was an English teacher, and both my grandfather as well as father were principals. So interesting fact about me. Actually, I was homeschooled starting in grade 5, and I ended up graduating and attending college when I was at 16.
Wow.
It was a little bit of a different route, going to college. But I would say that it was a great experience. Graduating, being homeschooled at 16, you're used to that one-on-one environment, right? So it was a little bit different going into an auditorium of 150, say, students as a freshman and trying to have that one-on-one connection, right? You didn't have that relationship that you would normally have that I had previously been experienced with. So learning, college, that first semester, learning the ropes was a little bit different for me, but obviously sought out. I had professors in their office hours, things like that. So once I finished college, then went into teaching as a high school science teacher. And interesting enough, that was my first time ever being in a high school classroom. So it was kind of like that unique experience, just having that as a background. But it kind of focused my attention on true instructional strategies. They're so important, right? So then I went and got my master's in school administration and then further doctorate in educational leadership. So that kind of fashioned my background. Eventually went into administration, and I was a dean, assistant principal, all at the high school level, and then went to the district office. They call it the dark side when I transitioned from the principal position. So a good experience. I would say that it's really kind of opened my eyes to so many different facets of education, and in terms of the teaching perspective versus looking at it more globally and holistically in terms of just carrying out initiatives. So that's kind of like me in a nutshell, but it's
Yeah.
been a very rewarding experience, but been very, very fortunate.
That's amazing. And, something I didn't know about you, which is awesome to see. And I'm really curious also, right? I know you kind of touched upon this, but how did your path kind of evolve from classroom teacher to district leader, right? You talked a little bit about your time as a high school teacher and then going into administration, but were there any key turning points that influenced your decision to step into some of those leadership roles over time?
Yeah, you know what? And that's a great question. I think there was a very pinpointed time that I can remember. I believe this was probably in my 8th year teaching when I was teaching in Garden Grove Unified School District. I remember at the start of the school year, we have our normal staff development meetings, to kick off the school year, or in our NPR with other teachers. And I just remember looking around, and I just thought to myself, I can have a greater impact on students than just the 180 that come into my classroom on a yearly basis. Just in that time, I just remembered I got out of I stepped out of the staff meeting, and then I enrolled at Pepperdine University, and then they had a master's program for school administration. So I enrolled in that, and ironically, I had until 3 o'clock to submit my application that day, right? So
Wow.
I remember that distinctly because I was on the ropes. I had to get my transcripts, I had to get all these different things to prepare my application, and I did it successfully. And then, I did in that program. That was right around a 2.5 year program. Once I completed that, the next year, after completing the program, I went into the dean position, then assistant principal, and then principal at the high schools. And then once I left the principal position, going into the district office, it was you're still busy, but it's a different kind of busy, right? But I still miss that interaction with students. The energy coming from a campus, that's one of the things. That's why I always try to get out and visit the school sites, because that's so important. And then knowing what kind of impact that you're having directly on the students that you're serving. So that's always important to me.
That's amazing. And I think you kind of a little like touched upon, how that experience, shaped the way you approach leadership. But were there any key points from your time as a teacher that you still kind of use to this day, as, the assistant director of student services? What were some of those kind of, learnings or insights or things that you saw that were, awesome that you still bring with you every day?
No, absolutely. I think early on in my teaching career, you feel like you're in silos, right? Everything that takes place in your classroom, I was under the impression that it's happening in every single other classroom, right? But in the actuality, it's not. So when you have that same curiosity, that same energy that you're trying to invest in your daily lesson plans and then wanting the students to learn at the same time you're enjoying that interaction and relationships that you're developing with your students. I was thinking that that's taking place in every classroom, and come to find out going into administration, that's not always the case. And then that's why it's essential for school administrators to intentionally shape the school culture, and because the culture of the school drives everything, right? So you have to foster a culture of collaboration, making sure that you have that risk value of feeling vulnerable, trying new lessons, trying new things. And if we're not able to adapt to certain new initiatives that are taking place, we're doing a disservice to our students, right? It's just like AI. How are we harnessing AI and we're taking that and then making that as a benefit and not an adversary? It's like we're trying to keep our students away from it, right? So
Yeah.
we're trying to harness that same thing and then make our students even better.
That's amazing. And I'm also curious too, right? Like, if you had to identify, maybe one guiding principle that shapes student services across the department, is there anything that would come to mind to you? And I'm sure there's so many of like the different areas and the different key focuses, but I'm just curious, like different guiding principles that probably come to mind, across, the department as a whole too.
Yeah, yes, I would say anytime that we're looking at, and this has kind of been my guiding principle from day one in setting out in education, building relationships. The power of relationships is so important, right? So building strong trusting relationships, so that way it fosters that trust with between the teacher and the student, between the teacher and the administrator, between teacher and families, right? The power of relationships is critical because they demonstrate the behaviors that you want to see. So, take for example, I'll just use the example of students being a product of their environment. Right, that's not only the case when they're at home, but it's also when they're at school, and then they're seeing behaviors being modeled by the teacher. Right, being collaborative, having those trusting those interactions, that sense of engagement, right? So the students want to come to school. Those are all things that are going to be positive behaviors that have to be modeled by the teacher, by the administrator. So it comes from top down. You need to make sure that you have your site leader that's going to be the champion of student success, the champion of positive student outcomes. That's essentially going to be something that the student can go ahead and say, "Hey, this is exactly what I needed to start doing," and reflect it, and then they will model it in turn.
That's amazing. And I guess, like, also just going off of that, right? How do you balance some of those like operational challenges, with such as attendance, behavior, with some of the long term goals you've set out, around, belonging, academic growth, and equity? Just curious on some of the ways that you're thinking about that. For your team as well, because that's always something that comes to mind. I hear attendance, attendance, attendance coming up so much, and it's just something that I'm like always thinking about in terms of like a district of like how do you balance all of that together, and what does that look like?
Sure. No, and I think that's a loaded question. I believe that there's so many different facets to that. It's one of those questions that it has to be a multi-tiered approach. All your initiatives have to be integrated. Okay, so like take for example your PBIS initiatives, ensuring that students are being supported, and then you have your different layers of support. Not looking just at punitive measures in order to correct student behavior, right? So we need to start taking a deeper look at root causes, finding out what sort of initiatives are targeted to be that are being implemented that are targeting certain student behavior, and looking at it from a holistic standpoint. Because if we're just simply going in and having a reaction to the student behaviors, those negative behaviors, and we're giving, hey, here's a detention or here's a suspension based on you acting out. Well, okay, what's the reason why the student's acting out? Let's get to the root cause of what that is, so that way we can accurate or accurately address what the concerns are for the student, because a student's just expressing what they're feeling, right? So if a student is out vaping in the restroom in the
Yeah.
400 building, well, okay, well, that's probably because something else is going to be a root cause for that, right? So we need to address those root causes, making sure that your initiatives are integrated and you have those integrated supports to help a student. That's when you can start to balance some of these initiatives to ensure that they're all pulling in the same direction and not being ran in parallel with each other without that collaborative piece.
I love that. And that kind of brings me to my next question too, because I'm almost thinking about different stories that have probably come. You've probably seen so many different students, so many different things that have come up. Exactly. And I was going to say, is there a particular, story or student that sticks with you, like from all these years, whether it's being a teacher, whether it's being an administrator, that, you still think about to this day? I'm always curious on like that one impact or one story that comes to mind.
Sure. I mean, and there's so many.
Yeah.
I would say the one that probably had an impact on me, and this is one of those things that really kind of just this rooted the importance of relationships and the power of relationships. I had a student. His name was Eric. I remember fourth period class. Always wanted to have a good relationship with my students. He was constantly asking me, "Time, Mr. Freeman," or they called me Freeman. Hey, can you come to my football game? Can you come to my football games? Right? Not knowing that this is going to be something that this as an individual that he cared about, and then wanted somebody to be in the stands to be the champion of him being out there, not really knowing the full story behind Eric, and knowing that, okay, well, he was a foster student. He just wanted somebody that he really admired to be there with him and enjoying the moments that he felt that he could excel. And I remember that early on in my teaching career, because I never went to one of his games. I never took the time. And then it wasn't until he was a senior that he stopped by, and he was, I think it was the last week of the seniors, and he stopped by, and we were chatting. And then I apologized to him. I was like, Eric, I apologize. I never came to one of your games. Once I got more of information coming from his counselor, knowing that he was a foster student, and then he was looking for that type of deeper interaction and engagements. So that really kind of put me on my heels. And then really impacted me in terms of the power of relationships, and then the power that teachers have in a classroom, and ensuring that they know their students, right? Because once you have that connection, then it might not they might not even like the content. I mean, students came to me and said, "Hey, I hate bio, right? But I love coming into the class because it's a fun class, right?" And they do it because of the person that's in that classroom with them. So that's one of the things too that I think really kind of gave me perspective. And I think moving forward into administration, my administrative career, I always knew that relationships were going to be the thing that's going to drive any kind of student engagement, keep students coming to school, positive attendance. So we're talking about having, positive attendance for students, creating that sense of student engagement. That's always going to be important.
It's amazing. And that story is honestly so touching because like you've just kind of like, seen so many different sides of your students, not just with the classes and, the textbooks and everything else, but it's also something beyond that, right? That dives into it. And I'm also kind of curious. I know you kind of briefly mentioned AI and you talked a little bit about that, but how do you see the role of student services and even of your students, evolving over the next like 3 to 5 years, right? What does that look like? Even as student demographics and educational policies shift a little bit, how are you thinking about that in terms of your, district or even just in terms of the state as a whole too?
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting, because I think with when when you're looking at education, there's so many different things that we need to be able to stay on top of, right? I remember as a principal was more on the lines of Chad, you're going to have 2,300 Chromebooks that are going to be sent to your front door at your school site. It's going to be up to you in order to determine what that's going to look like, how
Mhm.
you're going to deploy them, how your teachers are going to be able to use these as an instructional tool. And you're also looking at teachers that are veteran teachers that might be maybe 1 to 2 years outside of retirement, right? So why would they want to change their lesson plans that they have been implementing for decades, right? To be able to now use a Chromebook, which is something so foreign to them, right? That they're struggling even to use and looking at their email frequently, right? To much less now take something and now use this as an instructional tool, right? So I remember that, just thinking about it over the weekend after I got that information as far as the Chromebooks that were going to be delivered. And I was like, okay, I need to be able to flip professional development upside down. We
Yeah.
need to change. This needs to be a game changer, right? Because they were completely going in a different direction than the norm. So I remember contacting some of my teachers that I knew that were your cutting edge teachers, right? That were innovative, creative, and then like, hey, let's go ahead and whatever the initiative is going to be, let's go ahead and do it, right? So selecting up probably at three of those teachers on Canvas, and then also my influencers, the teachers that I knew that if they said something at, let's just say, in the staff room or
Yeah.
the water cooler, and having those conversations, other teachers were going to listen, right? And then I took them to what it's called the Q conference, the Computer Using
Oh.
Educators. It was located out here in Palm Springs, and then that where they had all these different workshops surrounding technology and Chromebooks, because everybody was now getting in on this bandwagon as far as how we're going to implement something like this. Because I did not want Chromebook, being a particularly expensive device, to be used as an expensive paperweight in the classroom and then not really using it, right? So what's the game plan? We need to have an action plan behind it. So what I did was I took those teachers out to the Q conference. We went out and visited all these different workshops. It was over like a 2 to 3 day time period. And then after each night, we'd come back together and say, how can we implement what we've learned? Everybody was kind of debriefing on everything that they saw for that day. And how can we implement that at the school site?
Hmm.
So again, we flipped to the professional development and we said, okay, we're going to go ahead and do certain workshops that we saw out here at the Q conference, and we're going to go ahead and incorporate that into our professional development. So we had teachers that would have a menu of the different workshops that each one of the teachers that went on the Q conference were going to be doing. And that way the teachers can sign up for it, right? That they can, it'd be like maybe a 30-minute session, a 45-minute session, but at least when they're signing up for it, the teachers were engaged and they were self-selecting based on their interests. So it sparked their curiosity. And it was geared towards their level of if they're tech, high tech, low tech, wherever it might be. So once we implemented that, I had, again, maybe only 5 to 6 teachers that presented. The following year, I had 20 teachers that were presenting in terms
Oh.
of workshops. And then by the end of, I would probably say at the following year, I would say it was close to half the teachers that were saying, I'm willing to share what I've been incorporating using Chromebooks in my classroom and then sharing that with their colleagues. So it was a really rewarding experience. And I would say we need to do the same thing for AI, using that same type of model and then incorporating that and making it less of a fear, but more of embracing it and saying, how can we actually use this?
That's amazing. And I love the way that you kind of, broke it up into different levels and then really tailored it to all the teachers to give them almost a menu of options, exactly like you said. So they get to pick and choose what works and what doesn't work. And you utilized your existing teachers who were those influencers and like diving ahead to do that, which is the best way to do it. And I'm also curious, did you ever have an educator or a mentor that had a really big influence on your leadership journey as an administrator? At what point did you kind of find those mentors? Was it early on in your career as a teacher? Was it when you stepped into being an administrator? What was that? What was the experience like finding that mentor educator? Because I know that's something that I always hear about. Even when you go to conferences, even when you go to events like Helsa or AXA, it's like, hey, how do you find these mentors in your space as you're moving to administration or to these other parts and other areas of a district?
Yeah, I would say my dad being a principal, a high school principal
Yeah.
himself, we always used to have those conversations. if it would be like a parent complaint or anything along those lines, just having that type of dialogue, right? So someone that can actually you can actually relate to and speaks the same language, right? And then to help guide certain steps to make sure that you're not walking into landmines that you're just unaware of, right? And it best how to strategize certain things. So yeah, having a mentor is huge. It's critical. So my dad was always a great mentor for me. My first principal when I was a teacher was
Yeah.
also a, a great mentor, just because I had so many questions. Again, being in the classroom for the first time, not having had the high school experience before, it was like I was always asking questions, right? So
Hmm.
that sense of curiosity was needed to have someone that I could ask those questions to, and just to it kind of guided my mindset. And again, it gave me perspective, because when you have perspective, it gives context, right, to whatever certain things that you're looking at completing or accomplishing. Yeah, mentoring is, I would say, I recommend that to the utmost for sure.
That's awesome. And I guess, like, last question that I always love to end with that's kind of fun is always just looking into a little bit on, your personal hobbies or passions, that keep you grounded. You're busy, you're doing so much. Is there, a travel destination? Is there, I was talking to one of the superintendents. She's a Lululemon ambassador and still does
Wow,
running, as part of that. So that was
very
her
cool.
personal connection. And I was like, you know what, this is a question that I got to bring in because I'm curious to see, what is that one thing that, gets you through those busy and long weeks. And, I know, of course, it's your amazing students, but also is there something for you personally that, you look to as in terms of that passion and that excitement too?
Yeah, I would say things that ground me. Spending time with my kids when you're so busy, you get caught up in the daily so often that you don't take enough time for yourself. Right, that self care is so important. And one of the things that really kind of grounds me is the relationship that I have with my kids. Because in terms of just their different personalities and looking at how they're developing. They have, they're coming from the same gene pool. They're just so different, right?
Yeah.
So this it's amazing to see. And then early on in my career, I was so, okay, I'm driven to get my education completed, right? Your master's, your doctorate, and things like that. But you don't take the time in order to enjoy what you have in front of you. For educators, I would say that that's so important. You have to, right? So whether it be taking your kid to a soccer game or going out for a walk, because I want to learn just have that relationship with each one of my kids individually, not necessarily, hey, we're doing this as a family. It's one of the lines of, hey, Troy, we're going to go ahead and do this, just me and you, right? Or, hey, Chloe, this is going to be something that we're going to do. My daughter, she loves to go out for boba. So we call it our
Oh.
boba. Yeah. So it's just having those kind of conversations and just setting that time aside so that we can kind of ground you. And then you're like, okay, well, this is kind of like what this is my why, right? This is why I do this for my kids, to make sure that we have that connection. Because again, it all comes back down to relationships. When the day's over, your office to your door is locked, someone else can open up that door the very next day, right? It's what you are going to impart to my kids. What are they going to view of their dad, when
Hmm.
I'm gone? What is that going to what's that message going to be in their minds? So it's so important. You just the family, just keep family first, and then I would say that that's going to be probably the most rewarding experience that I've had.
That's amazing. And, that's also just so important because sometimes, you get lost in the weeds of work and you're just, tied down with those meetings. And then you remember at the end of the day, hey, there's something bigger, that you're looking out for. So I really well said. And, once again, I just want to thank you so much for giving such great perspective across so many different areas. Across your work, across your journey, across your education journey, which is so important. Hearing that, you had that experience growing up, where you went to college really early and you grew into the awesome leader and educator that you are is amazing. So I just want to thank you so much for, taking the time for joining me today. And, for leaving some really awesome words to our audience today. So I really appreciate all of the amazing learnings that we were able to have during this conversation too.
I absolutely appreciate the time.
Thank you so much.
Right.
Excellent.